So hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion today, Perspectives on AI, Hype, and Security. My name is Nathan Hamiel. I'm Senior Director of Research at Kudelski Security, where I lead the fundamental and applied research team, and we focus on the security of emerging technologies. But probably more important for this particular conversation, I am the AI, machine learning, and data science track lead for Black Hat. One of the things that we wanted to do with Forward Focus was to kind of create an area where we could have discussions around topics that may not fall into any particular category where we have tracks. It just so happens that probably the largest topic, if you couldn't tell by all of the presentations, is the topic of AI. And if you are trying to make sense of where things are, there is a lot of muddy water. Mm-hmm. It's hard to understand where things are. The press wants you to believe that ChatGPT is all four horsemen of the apocalypse. And you have people who also think that AI is such an existential threat that we should have military strikes against data centers, apparently not understanding how data replication actually works. And it goes even further than that, because we have a group of people called AI hustle bros whose sole purpose is to get you to watch their YouTube videos or join their Substacks. And they tend to make these predictions that are rather outlandish. So things like LLMs are going to be more impactful than the printing press, or that GPT-5 is going to be some sort of AGI. But if you think about how we got here because ChatGPT reached a sort of social contagion status. And that highlighted some fundamental vulnerabilities in humans, and that is that we are very poor at creating tests and very good at filling in the blanks. So we look at experiments and cherry-picked examples, and we say, take my money, sometimes literally in the case of people who hooked AutoGPT up to their bank accounts. So what we wanted to do was create a forum where we could have some experts speak on this topic and try to provide you a grounded perspective on where things are and what you can expect in the next few years. Because there are a lot of questions that kind of come out of this. So as it was mentioned, this is the first part. We're happy to stick around and answer questions in the wrap room. And I hope you find this useful. So without further ado, I will allow the panelists to introduce themselves, because it's always awkward when somebody else introduces me. So go ahead.
Hello, my name is Ariel Herbert-Voss. I currently run a company called Run Sybil, where we automate hacker intuition using LLMs, RL, other AI, things like that. And prior to that, I was the first security researcher at OpenAI, where I worked on GPT-3 and on Codex, and I also ran our first red team for GPT-3.
I'm Rich Harang. I'm a principal security architect at NVIDIA, where I specialize in in AI and ML systems, and I've been at sort of the intersection of machine learning, network security, and privacy for about 12 years now.
Oh, gee, both of them. My name is Ram. My pronouns are he, him. And for this panel, I'm going to wear my hat as a tech policy fellow at UC Berkeley, where I look at intersectional issues between the legal implications of attacking machine learning systems, what are the policy implications, and how we should think about those.
Great. And they were all very, very, very gracious with their time, because this was almost a very last-minute thing. In the past couple weeks, they were gracious enough, even though they all had talks or training at Black Hat and they were all trying to finish things up, they all were nice enough to donate their time. So we'll get into it. So I guess we've been hearing a lot about large language models, and that's probably a good thing to caveat here. Like when we talk about hype, we are talking about generative language models for the most part. So we're not talking about somebody overhyping a random forest or something like that. So kind of keep that in mind as we have these conversations. But let's get to the burning question that is on everybody's mind. So are the capabilities of large language models overhyped? And if they are, what are some of the risks from that? So Ari, you want to go first?
Sure. It's a hard answer because the answer is both yes and no. And the reason for this is because it's actually quite hard to measure the capabilities of these large language models in the context of security and some other areas. Part of that being that when you're training a large language model, you're training on as much text as possible, which means that if you're training on all of GitHub, that means that you can't really evaluate on any part of GitHub. So you can't actually, when somebody shows you a demo of using ChatGPT to drive something, you have to kind of keep in the back of your mind of like, is this part of the training set or is it not? Like, how is somebody evaluating this sort of thing? Like, we don't currently have any open benchmarks for this sort of thing. That said, like, there's obviously a lot of overhype. There's plenty of examples of people promising one thing and then not being able to deliver on that, even in the context of like the same press cycle for a lot of this kind of stuff. But that said, like, there's a lot of promise to using these models for a lot of things that we haven't even thought up yet. Like, it's very powerful to be able to give tools to experts to allow them to kind of play around to see what kind of things they come up with, because that's where we figure out where the boundaries are.
So, Rich?
Yeah, I think I broadly agree. They're very cool, and people are rightfully very excited about them because they do a lot of really neat things. But they do have limitations which I don't think we have a really solid grasp on yet, and they're not getting as much attention as the really cool as the cool capabilities that they bring to the table. So I think I'm coming at it from a space of cautious optimism, right? We know a lot about the capabilities and the good things that they can do, and what we need to do is be more rigorous in evaluation to try and find the gaps and make sure that we are not putting them into positions where we're asking them to complete tasks that they fundamentally cannot do. So there's been, just pivoting off of the evaluation question, right? We've had a lot of debate just recently about whether or not they can reason, right? So this has been for the past, I think, 2 days on like ML Twitter. There's been some discussion about that. And part of the problem is we have, in a lot of cases, very different understandings of things like, can they plan, right? What do we mean by that? Can they reason? What do we mean by that? And designing benchmarks to actually answer those questions, yes or no, is very hard. So, yeah, they definitely are very cool, but I think we need to be more thoughtful and thorough about our evaluations of them.
Oh, I broadly agree with both of them. Don't have any additional insights to kind of offer. So, yeah.
Oh, great. I think my biggest concern about this kind of rapid adoption of large language models is really around the haphazard integration into platforms and services. And there seems to be a new paradigm whereby you are kind of collapsing your application functionality down, making it less modular and more error prone, because it's really hard to troubleshoot when you have this big long prompt and you're asking it to do many things, where exactly it went wrong in that cycle. I think some people think explainability in terms of large language models is asking the model to explain itself, and that's really not how explainability works. Yeah. So great. So now let's get to a big question. So when will AI replace us in security? Go, Rich. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, I'll float it.
Yeah.
But on that front, there are, on the jobs front, are security teams really prepared for the sheer amount of AI-powered products that are about to enter the market? Now, these could be products that they either have to use or maybe evaluate from a security perspective, because some of the skills are, maybe more on the ML side than on the security side. Yeah. So, Rich, what's your perspective on that? And what are some of the things that they might be able to do to augment themselves if they're not prepared?
Yeah, so I think there's two questions buried in that. First is, when you're deploying an application that has an ML component, what do you do? And the second is, how can you use ML to help you do your job better? So on the first front, I think it's really important to understand that ML models are specialized and maybe slightly finicky software components. It's software. There's the specific techniques to exploit these ML models are in some cases new, and in some cases require a little bit of math or a little bit of trickery to do. But the security problems that you're trying to address are fundamentally the same. We have decades of well-worn, hard-earned security expertise that applies to generic software. And really the challenge is just getting the data science folks and the people building models to think a little bit about the models that they are building as software components that do need some security knowledge baked into them. And then the security teams, I think, need to begin to develop an understanding, maybe not the details of every single individual attack, but the broad scope of what the attack surface for machine learning models looks like. And so by sort of bridging that gap, and if I can do a little bit of self-promotion, we had a training that we just finished up on doing exactly that kind of thing, exposing security people to the kinds of attacks that machine learning models are vulnerable to. By sort of bringing these two communities together, getting a little more security knowledge into the ML folks, getting a little ML knowledge into the security folks, we can leverage all of this expertise that we have and use it to help secure these models. But if I drive no other point home in this panel, it's that at the end of the day, these ML models are software. And you can use the same body of knowledge we have and adapt it to the ML context.
Yeah, I think it's a very insightful point. And to going back to tying to your question of talent, it's kind of interesting because if you were to give a security professional and say, okay, here's a word processor, try to secure it. I think it's almost like a platform, right? People can use it to write specs. People can use it to write hate mail. People can use it to write syllabus. So at some level, all these ML models, I think the reality that people face is that they're actually platforms. There's one vantage point that's security. The other vantage point for me is it's really, you're not shipping a software by itself, but you're shipping a platform that can enable other things. And to go back to Ari's point that he referenced, we do not know what this platform is capable of. And the interesting thing is as the platform evolves, it may just have a new capability. It's the property of emergence. So how, as security professionals, are we going to test what looks like a very generic purpose tool, like a hammer or like a Word document? And B, what if the hammer, grows a new functionality? What if all of a sudden your oven can not just bake things, but can also kind of tell you what time is it? How are you going to be testing for that? I think that is really an open-ended problem.
For some reason, I had a mental image of Maslow's hammer for some reason. Capabilities. It kind of throws the whole paradox into.
Yeah.
I actually have a follow-on question for you, so I'm not skipping you. So when we talk about capabilities of security professionals, I think one of the things that we think is the most human is in offensive security, things like red teaming. We feel like the defensive side has had machine learning in their products for quite some time, but sometimes those of us who work in offensive security tend to think that, hey, well, that's fine for them, but not for us. So where is this stuff headed for red teaming and offensive security? What's real now, and then what maybe over the next year or two can we expect to see?
We're in kind of a special moment right now because, as you say, machine learning has been used in defense for a long time. But the context in which it's been used, it's mostly discriminative models. So things like classifying, is this piece of code malicious or not? Or is this signature malicious or not? It's very much like a classification problem. But we're now in this new era of generative AI. It's not like the other stuff has gone away, but what generative allows you to do is it allows you to kind of try out a bunch of new things, which is exactly what we like to do in offense. Is you get to unlock a bunch of new capabilities just by banging around on a bunch of stuff. So it's like a new kind of fuzzing, kind of. I mean, I don't want to draw too many connections between fuzzing and generative AI because there's a lot of stuff. But it's new in that there are new capabilities that we're able to unlock because we're in this new paradigm of generation versus discrimination and classification, which is exciting.
Great. So how many people in here are worried that their job might not be replaced, but maybe changed significantly? And it's really hard for me to see because these lights are blaring me in the face. Okay, so not very many people. That's good. How many people here have heard of AlphaGo beating Lee Sedol, the best Go player in the world? Yeah. Wow, that is surprisingly few people. Well, then what I have to say won't really matter too much, because I was going to say how many people have heard of Stuart Russell's lab coming up with attacks that allow even an average Go player to beat these superhuman Go AIs. I figured there would be nobody.
Yeah.
I think there's a really good parallel here between what's happening now and for security, because it seems that every time we launch one of these systems, we seem to find new areas where there are holes that can be manipulated and that need to be addressed. So keep calm and yeah, carry on, I guess. So that's pretty good. So let's move on to something else. So one of the things that comes up most often when I talk to security leaders is they're concerned about the confidentiality and privacy aspects, because they hear that there are some companies that are not allowing access to ChatGPT. They kind of understand that it's a generative language model and it can generate things maybe based off of like private data. So I think that's very well worn. But what are some other things that maybe security leaders aren't thinking of right now that may be coming down the road, whether it be regulatory, privacy, security, or whatever? So.
Yeah, I think you kind of shepherded the answer for me. I think the regulatory aspect is going to be something that if I were a CISO, it's going to be something on top of my mind. I'll give you a very concrete example. In the EU AI Act, for foundational models, if you're building like high-risk applications, you would have to register your ML model. And one of the ways you register it is you need to have done some sort of assessments on it. So that's why I'm very excited for folks like Ari who are like building these sort of tools to enable existing red teams to kind of do assessments on them. So you need to think about assessments. You need to think about like the points that Rich alluded to. Are you like even patching your PyTorch vulnerabilities? Yeah. Those are like basic questions that's going to come up. And that's not really as, to use a very crude word, like as attractive or as like, gets the headlines. But really banging down on the traditional security aspect of it is going to be something, it's going to be a rude awakening for folks if you're not actively preparing for it.
Well, great. That kind of leads to a follow-up question that I scribbled in the margins. So you mentioned, security people getting more involved. A lot of the algorithmic accountability and a lot of these other things that may be specified in some of this legislation aren't really security functions. They don't really fall into the security team. But what we've kind of seen in previous regulations like GDPR and things like that some of the controls are security related, and we saw that GDPR kind of crept into the GRC space. Yeah. So do you think that some of this stuff that's coming out in this regulation is going to be more and more applicable to security teams in the future?
That's an excellent question. And I have like a couple of data points to kind of bolster my thesis that yes, it's going to take a village to certify. And what village? The AI village. We'll come to that in just a minute. The kind of work that Rich is doing in terms of CTFs. So first off, yes, because from a regulatory perspective, security is one angle that they care about, but they care about explainability, they care about fairness, they care about bias, they care about transparency. And what the horror scenario for me is a CISO who has a little pot of money is going to buy a security solution, and a CDAO or like the knowledge officer is going to buy a fairness-related solution, and they're not talking to each other, and that's going to create a lot of very unexpected interactions. The second thing, so you don't want that to happen. You want to kind of like actively work together with the remainder of your team. The second one is these inherent properties tend to have some sort of trade-off. So it turns out that the more, you cannot just take one defense and apply it, to an ML problem and expect all the data points to be defended same. So you need to have like conversations with folks who specialize in fairness. And interestingly enough, and this is like almost like sand on people's shoes, the responsible AI community has co-opted the word red teaming to mean something very, very different from what we think of as red teaming. So there's this complicated set of factors that is going to coalesce, and funnily enough, the ones who are going to bring everybody into the room is going to be the regulators.
There's a sunny future for us.
There's a sunny future. There's something for that. But I'd love to get rich, like, you're organizing the CTF.
I'm supporting the
You're
CTF.
supporting.
It's Will Pierce is the one.
Oh yeah, Will Pierce is doing that. I'm very intrigued by that because it's not just focused on security, right? There's like all these other angles to it, but it's the broader, it's a CTF style competition, right?
Yeah, so there's the AI Village, like the ML CTF, and then there is the LLM red teaming exercise, which is a separate thing, and that's Sven Gattel has been the one carrying most of the weight on that, I believe. Yeah, I think we might see sort of the same semi-convergence that you alluded to between like regulatory and security, right? Less security folks do have to worry about GDPR topics, for instance. Yeah. Some of the same controls that, we have to be able to say, hey, was this record in our data? And we're going to see the same thing, except it's now, instead of do you hold this record and expose it somewhere else, do you hold this record and did it go into your model?
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of questions that I think regulation will force ML companies to be able to be responsive to. When it comes to things like fairness and ethics and transparency, I kind of feel like those tend to be very situational and very context-driven. So my other hobby horse that I come to a lot is you have to know what you want the model to do. If you have a model whose job is something like toxicity detection, you are by necessity going to have to expose it to a bunch of toxic speech. And if you run it in a generative mode, it's going to be something where you don't want to show those outputs to other people. Right? So that is one application where you might have to do things that someone who's sort of very narrowly focused on like LLM should never produce bad things might miss. You might actually damage the use case. But you have to think about where you're deploying it, who gets exposed to those outputs, who can provide inputs to that, where the training data came from, does the training data reflect the kind of problem that you're trying to solve? And all of that sort of bakes together into just knowing what metrics you want to hit with your model. So if you can do a good evaluation, then you're not going to be surprised by my friendly little chatbot suddenly said something horrible to someone else.
Never happens.
Never happens.
Yeah, it never happens. Yeah.
So I think like the regulatory thing is actually going to bring a bunch of people into the room, and I think in the long run it will be a good thing because it will support all of these other things that we are worried about, because we'll now have a handle on our training data, we'll have a handle on our pipeline, we'll be able to say what data went into what model, and that makes everything safer and fairer and more transparent because we know kind of what we want the model to do and how we trained it.
Totally agree.
Great. Anything to add or?
No, that's great.
Okay, great. Well, good. You're getting the next one because one of the things I really wanted to cover here has to do with the malicious use of AI. So you can't open any article in the tech press without hearing about like fraud GPT or worm GPT or something like that. And we've seen experiments too where people have created malware with Chat GPT. And they look like it was fun research to do and it was necessary, but a lot of times it doesn't really connect the dots for like real world attacks. So the big question here is, will LLMs supercharge attackers?
Yeah, he gave Ari the easy question.
You get all the
hardest questions.
Okay, my spicy answer is no.
Oh.
Because, and the reason why is, I mean, there's a lot of argument over whether or not these things raise the skill ceiling or the skill floor. Floor ceiling, you know what I mean. And what they're missing is that you kind of have to, as Rich said, like you have to understand what you're doing, what you want the model to do. And if you don't know like any assembly, if you don't know anything about like the context in which you are working, you don't know anything about Windows internals, you don't know anything about Linux internals, and you're planning on doing something in that sort of space, what are you doing? Like you don't even know the right questions to ask. It's like, does Google supercharge people? I mean, in some cases, yes. Like, it does give you like quicker access to the information that you need to accomplish your goal. Like, I'm not going to argue against that, but I am going to push back on this idea that it can kind of lift the floor a bit, because you have to understand what you're doing first.
Rich?
Yeah, basically the same. It removes, so it will make I think it does help attackers scale a little bit, right? The same way that like you can use ChatGPT right now to write, a journal article a little bit faster, a little bit more efficiently. But you do have to know what you're doing, because we see very often with AI-generated code, for instance, there are subtle bugs that are introduced because it's either in the training data or you set the temperature a little too high when you ran the model forward. And if you don't understand what you're doing, it's just not going to work. It's not going to do what you need it to do. So could it accelerate attackers a little bit? Yes. Long term, will it be a useful tool in their back pocket? I'm sure it will be at some point. But on the other side of that, all of these tools are inherently dual use, right? Anything that it helps an attacker do, you can also imagine it helping a defender do, right? So it's going to change the landscape a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be like a completely upended world that we find ourselves in.
Anything to add?
I actually have a follow-up question for Ari.
Oh, go ahead.
So, Ari, you wrote this like seminal piece on like the security aspects of GPT-2. Was that like in 2018, 2019? I forget. 2019, I forget. And I loved your observation there, which is like, hey, adversaries are not really using this at that point, if I'm remembering that thesis correctly. And we've seen like capabilities of GPT like expand vastly. And I was very like, I like your spicy answer, no, because like, given, GPT-2 adversaries didn't use, that makes so much sense. GPT-4 can write poems and can do all these other things. Do you still see that, yes, the ML capability is like really overshot, but adversaries are not waking up to that? I would love your thoughts on that.
That's a great question.
I'm just learning from Nathan, by the way. I took a peek at his notebook before this, if you're asking me how I get them. Yeah.
So the question being, could you?
Yeah, the ML models like capabilities are like vastly expanding, but adversaries don't seem to be using it. Do you have an?
They are using it.
Oh, they are.
Yeah,
Okay,
they are in fact using it. But the question is, are they effective? And to Rich's point about Blue Team also picking up the slack here, like a lot of people are starting to use it in the SOC for doing triage and for other things like that. And so it's always going to be a bit of a Red Queen race. The question is like, where are we with regards to like who's winning currently? But things are happening so quickly that I think if you take the average, you'll see that we're kind of in the same place as we were previously. It's just the techniques are different. Things are happening more rapidly, which means security teams have to kind of adjust to what is going to happen. Because there's a lot of things that are going to be more economically feasible than previously. And we don't really have a good picture of what those are because we also don't know how to benchmark the capabilities yet. So there's a lot of open questions, but if you were to ask me to take the temperature on this thing, I'd say it's about the same.
I mean, we're squarely in sort of like Red Queen race territory.
Yeah, totally.
And I think we're actually having a conversation that's far lower level than like what Fraud and Worm GPT are doing, because when they're reporting in the press, basically these tools are writing phishing emails and doing social engineering stuff, and we're talking about like super hard problems.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is a disconnect. It's called Worm GPT, but it doesn't. It's not building worms. So the dark web has great marketing people too. So the same way that we're talking about this. In this open forum, they are also having the same conversations.
Another thing on those is that if you've actually used any of those like illicit models, they don't work. Like it's actually pretty bad. There's like I've done some experiments on these, and there's like it's like a 27% success rate using certain models for certain things, and that's not that much. I mean, if you try to use like off-the-shelf language models that have been trained by like professionals, those have a much better hit rate. And if you've also fine-tuned your own for specific use cases that you need and you know quite well, you also get a better hit rate. But with these ones, it feels like they're made by people mostly for the splash versus for actual utility. Yeah, well, they'd probably have a higher success rate if the generated HTML for the email didn't have in the header like something malicious site or whatever it had. I think it had like financial institution, fraud site or something was literally in the header. So they have a little bit of work to do.
as a large language model, I encourage you to click this link.
So I want to get, I know we're running a little bit short on time. This is a great conversation. You know, in keeping with like trying to close, maybe we'll have another question or two, but what are some of the most interesting things, maybe some interesting use cases where people have used large language models to solve a problem, or maybe it's some interesting research that's coming along? What are some of the things that you've seen that you're excited about? So I don't know where I left off. Rich, maybe?
Oh, sure. So this isn't really a large language model. It's
Yeah, let me back out of that question. Let's take large language models off the table because I'd rather talk about other things potentially that's getting missed. Because I think with the hype around LLMs, there was some interesting research that was happening that seemed to almost be abandoned. Like it's kind of a bit of an off-ramp. So yeah, it could be about anything in the space.
Yeah. So it is a transformer architecture, which is sort of the core element that makes these large language models work. We're starting to see like protein folding take off and using large language model type architectures in drug development and in protein synthesis. And I think that this is like super fascinating. My background is actually biochemistry, if you go back far enough.
Wow.
And protein folding was like this holy grail that if we could unlock it, it would solve all of these problems for us. And we actually have large language model type ML models at this point that do a really good job. I don't think they're perfect, but they're much better than anything in the past at predicting protein folding, right? And so this opens the door to drug discoveries, to potentially gene therapy, stuff like that. And it's super exciting. And I mean, there was a Wired article about something in the same general space this morning, but I see less attention paid to it than I think it deserves because it's really cool work.
All right.
I will take a different angle because I'm wearing the policy hat. The thing that excites me is, number one, when, if somebody were to give like confidence building measures exist in nuclear systems where, you can kind of verify like, okay, I understand that we're all up to code. We don't have that capability in like machine learning systems. So, work on verification I think is very underappreciated. Closer to home for me, the security aspect is very interesting. We just don't understand why large language models fail. Is it by design? Is it a feature? Is it a bug? We just don't know. And there's really interesting work, especially like not just empirical work, but also like undergirding of like theoretical evidence, trying to explore that. I think that is really exciting for me.
Great. All right.
I see language models going in two directions in terms of products. One which is along the lines of search. Like it's a new paradigm for search. It's a new way in which you can interact with information and ask queries, have it bring back information to you so you can go about doing whatever your task is. The other thing being agents, which are like a step above that, where you have a language model that also has access to tools and to other things that you can kind of drive. And so you can ask it to go out and do things for you. I'm
like
very
destroy the world.
Oh man. That requires like good scope,
yes,
to be clear. But I'm very excited to see like what kind of stuff happens there because there's a lot of like generally useful things that you get out of these two paradigms, and I'm excited to see like where things go in more of like a general sense of like having a new Google, like being able to just go and ask stupid questions about something that I don't necessarily know too much about, but be able to get enough information that I can probe deeper, and then also just being able to like, not to hype my own stuff, but I'm very excited about agents.
Oh, great. So very quickly, as we run out of time, this is an impromptu question. It wasn't on the list. I have tons of questions that I didn't get to. Sorry, we'll be around afterwards. But so for security professionals, for people trying to learn more, obviously we would encourage whatever jet just flew over the hotel to be mindful of what we're doing. But how can, I assume you would say, join the AI Village, Discord server, and engage with people in conversations. But what are some other things, very quickly, that you think people should do to kind of just wrap their mind around this a little bit?
Spend time with models. Like, don't read the press. Just use the thing. Figure out where the edges are. Everybody has their own special abilities, special information, there's something special about everybody, and there's something that you bring to the table that not everybody else can, and so probe information that you know better than anybody else and figure out where the edge is, and then use that to inform your take on whether or not these things are something you should be concerned about. I would also say that you shouldn't worry about like AI taking your job, but you should worry about somebody who knows how to use AI better than you taking your job.
Oh, I want that on a t-shirt. You know, I think on the same lines as Ari, I think there's a lot of great material. Things that come to my mind is Johan Rudenberger, I think it's like Hacker Alias's Wonder Wizzy. It's like really does like a lot of great posts. There's Kai Grishaki. So there's a lot of really great people in the community who are putting out extremely good work. Go read them out. You're not going to find them in textbooks or books anytime soon because it's a rapidly evolving space. Keep it in a growth mindset.
Yeah, I'd just say the only other thing I'd add to both of those great responses is there are models that are being used in the wild other than LLMs right now. And those also have an attack surface. And they also are vulnerable to some things. And it's worth keeping those in mind as you are integrating them into systems. So don't hyper-focus on LLMs. I know they're super cool, they're super exciting, but the world of ML models is very wide. The attacks against them are very diverse, and it's worth knowing about them even if you don't understand all of the details of how to implement them. As someone who's like a security professional, if you just know, hey, this particular vulnerability exists in this class of models, I think we sort of turn it into the same thing as like, hey, if I'm using SQL, I know I need to like build these protections in, right? I need to sanitize my inputs. If I'm using a vision model in this spot, right, I need to think about how do I have to worry about, you know, evasive samples or something like that. So cast a broad net. I will, you know, hype our course one more time. We did cover a lot of that in the class we just taught. But yeah, and there's tons of resources online. The AI Village is a great one. The people that were mentioned. So yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much for your time. I have a couple of final thoughts. So I think one of the things you should prepare for is to be surprised. And I know we're all security professionals. We hate surprises, even on our birthdays. But we should be surprised. There's lots of work happening, lots of you know, people building products, people experimenting, and you should experiment yourself. And keep in mind that when you're reading articles in the press and you're reading people's whatever lists that they have, remember that fantasy always sells more copies than reality. So Lord of the Rings will always sell more books than Eat Your Vegetables. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking around. I mean, the internet and talking heads, they can make things up and they never have to justify them. But I mean, we live in the real world where our software has to actually work and be reliable and scale, you know, all of the unfun things of actually writing software. So I would like to make a prediction, which I don't normally do because the irony of saying that the world is too complicated to understand. But I think here in the short term, as we start maximizing large language models and collapsing application functionality down, what's going to happen is we are going to replace known reliable methods with less reliable probabilistic methods for things that we already know how to do. And the downside of that is we could be creating software that just degrades, and the only fix is just to try again. And we don't want to train people that, you know, that's just the way software works. If you don't get the right answer, you just keep doing it over and over again. But it's not the worst thing. So the other byproduct of this is we will allow people to manipulate our applications in ways that we didn't intend. I've mentioned that large language models are kind of like having a single interface and an unlimited number of undocumented protocols. And it's these undocumented protocols that attackers will take advantage of. So look there. I didn't even say like and subscribe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.